Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Foll. I'm a former NASA astronaut. I was born in Great Britain, but my mother is American and my father was a British Royal Air Force pilot. With that combination, I was able to apply to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to become an astronaut. It began with many small steps, and the first of them was to finish a PhD in astrophysics at Cambridge University in England, to move across to the Houston Johnson Space Center in America. And while wanting to be an astronaut, I was not yet able to apply because there wasn't a selection process. I had to find a job. And I worked in Houston at the Johnson Space Center for 2 years before I became, before I was finally selected as an astronaut. When I was working at NASA, I had a job in payload operations. And this was a job very much like the ones you've seen at the European Space Agency, where people are working in a control center. They have knowledge about the spacecraft that they are controlling and monitoring as they do carry out their missions in space. And my job was to carry out payload operations for the space shuttle. The space shuttle carried cargo into space, including telecommunication satellites that we all take for granted today, that achieve all of the amazing communications that we have around the Earth and between the planets. These satellites were being carried on the space shuttle, and my job was to know how the satellite worked functionally, not in terms of the electronics and all of the details of the mechanical engineering, but functionally, what key operations take place in that satellite, and to monitor the behavior of that satellite when it was launched on the space shuttle. So I can tell you now a little bit about what I was doing during those missions. In the control center, I was called the payload officer, and I was sitting in the mission control center that I think many people in the world have seen on TV when we've conducted space missions, both to the International Space Station, but before that, space shuttle missions, and before that, the Apollo missions that landed on the moon. So in that control center, which was an amazing honor for me to do as a young man, I was about 27, I had a sign in front of me called Payload Officer. And when the space shuttle, for example, Space Transportation System, that's STS-61B launched, we were launching 2 SATCOM RCA satellites to geosynchronous orbit. And those satellites were probably worth $200 or $300 million each, but they were flying on the space shuttle for quite a low price, much lower than the price of building those satellites. And I had, in the previous year, visited that company, worked with their engineers, worked with their program manager, and developed drawings and procedures that the astronauts that were launching on STS-61B would use to deploy that satellite out of the cargo bay of the space shuttle, where it would then move away, or actually the shuttle would move away from it, and then it would fire its final rocket motor, a solid rocket motor, and thrust it up towards geosynchronous orbit. All those tasks on those missions, the space shuttle missions 51G, 51I, 61B, and 61C, they were all cargo missions on the space shuttle carrying communication satellites up to geosynchronous orbit. Now, the space shuttle can't go up that high. It can only go to low Earth orbit. But my job was, as the payload officer in the control center, to know the details of those satellites, how they worked, help train the astronauts with procedures that I wrote and developed, knowing the satellite. And then the astronaut trainers would train the astronauts to operate those satellites in a simulator. And then during the actual mission, I would be in the mission control center watching displays, seeing how those satellites' critical parameters are behaving on the space shuttle. And at the right moment, I would give the go to the flight director in that control center to say, flight, we are go for deploy. At which point, the Capcom would call the crew on the space shuttle and say, Columbia, we are go for the deploy of the SATCOM. And at which point they would throw a switch and it would release locks in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and this satellite would rise up out of the cargo bay with a booster underneath it, a solid rocket booster. And then the space shuttle would move away to a safe distance, a few kilometers. And about 45 minutes later, after that deploy, as the satellite crosses the right point in the orbit, the intersects the plane of the orbit with the equator, and because they're going to geosynchronous orbit, then that PAM motor would fire, and the solid rocket motor would boost it and add another few thousand meters per second to get the satellite up to geosynchronous orbit. At that point, once that motor's fired, my job's done, and all the astronauts on the space shuttle and the flight controllers in the Mission Control Center room would all relax and cheer, because from that point onwards, all of the operations were now in the hands of the satellite builder. And that's basically what I did for a year and a half while working at NASA, before I was finally selected by the NASA Astronaut Selection Committee, which was my third try, by the way. So basically, I was in Houston, working at the Johnson Space Center, becoming more experienced in operations. I was a good scientist. I had a PhD from Cambridge in astrophysics. But I had to show to the astronaut colleagues that I would be working with, many of whom had military backgrounds and could fly fast fighter jets, for example, or could work as special operations engineers. I had to show them that I could actually think well on a timeline, using procedures, not panic, not freeze up, and be reliable in carrying out operations that are basically irreversible. When you fire a rocket motor or a solid rocket motor, that's irreversible. You can't undo it. So, and you must do it at the right time, in the right direction. And so that was what I was doing as a payload officer. I was building up my resume to become an astronaut. Once there were two astronaut selection periods before I was finally selected. And each of those I was interviewed, but I was not good enough to make the final 20 or so, 15 or so astronauts that were selected. When I was 30 years old, it was 1987, and the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up in 1986, at the beginning of 1986. It was a huge trauma for the United States, and maybe for the world, because so many small children were watching that launch, because the first teacher, Christa McAuliffe, was flying on it. Nonetheless, in spite of that accident, NASA regrouped, found out what the problem was, and corrected it. And during that time, it needed to select more astronauts, not just because astronauts had left because of the accident, but because time had passed. And I was interviewed the third time in 1987 and selected in August of that year. And from that point onwards, I had a career at NASA from 1987 until 2013 as a NASA astronaut. Okay, GNC, Guidance, Navigation, and Control, is the moniker by which, at least in the Western world, we describe the spacecraft systems that are required to guide, i.e. control, a spacecraft in a specific direction and at a specific speed. That's the guidance part. Navigation is the means by which, as you do that, the spacecraft looks around with its sensors and knows where it is at this moment. and knows where it needs to go to later on, where it's trying to get to, for example, geosynchronous orbit. And that navigation is done with sensors. And then control is the method by which you actually move the spacecraft to achieve the convergence of the guidance, which is where we want to be. The navigation is where we are. And the control, it moves rocket motors or thrusters to operates those to make those two things come together, the guidance and the navigation, to, and we use the word converge in the space business. So that in the space shuttle, there are a number of sensors, and I'll start with the sensors first before we go on to the guidance briefly, and then the control. The sensors on the space shuttle, for knowing where it are many. There are three inertial measurement units. These basically consist of three individual gyroscopes and gimbals that originally were made as mechanical gyroscopes, but were then subsequently replaced with laser gyroscopes. So those inertial measurement units are able to detect absolute orientation of the space shuttle, or of the box, the platform, the IMU, relative to the stars. And they have to be aligned to a specific set of stars before you begin any navigation task. With the space shuttle, that began on the launch pad, and the tail of the space shuttle was pointed to due south. And they would align the inertial measurement units on the launch pad before liftoff. So that was one set of equipment. And they are the key by which the space shuttle knows which way it's pointing. Next, in space, when you are, well, there's another set of measurement units that measure angular rate, not just the angle that you are in terms of absolute space, inertial space, but the rate at which the angles are changing. They are called rate gyros, and there were, I think, a set of 4 of those on the space shuttle. Some at the back end of the space shuttle and some at the front end of the space shuttle, because the space shuttle was of the order of 50 meters long, and for that reason, rates at one end of the vehicle might be different from rates at the other due to flexion of the whole spacecraft structure. So you have rate gyros as well. Once you're in orbit, those inertial measurement units drift, and they become they have more and more error relative to the inertial reference frame that they were aligned to on the launch pad. And the way they achieve realignment of the inertial measurement units is to use 2 instruments called star trackers. And one looked out the plus Y axis of the space shuttle, and the other looked up the minus Z or Z axis of the space shuttle. So those are the sensors on the space shuttle for navigation. Control. So how do you control the space? That's a fairly obvious one when you look at the space shuttle. The space shuttle is basically a combination of aircraft and rocket. Let's talk about the rocket bit. The rocket control starts with the main engine bells, the 3 main engine bells that burn cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen at the bottom of the shuttle, and they can vector in 2 planes. And we call that thrust vector control of each individual engine nozzle, engine bell. It looks a bit like a bell, like a cupola. The solid rocket boosters also could gimbal their nozzles in 2 planes. And with a combination of the 2 solid rocket boosters on either side gimbaling their thrust vector control, as well as the 3 main engines, you could control the attitude of the space shuttle in all 3 directions: pitch, roll, and yaw during launch. In addition, once the solid rocket boosters have come off, and once the main engines of the space shuttle have ceased operating and you're in space, in orbit, then there are 2 additional systems that can be used to control the spacecraft. One of them are two larger engine bells than the reaction control system, which are small little rocket motors. The larger engine bells that are on the back of the space shuttle, called the orbital maneuvering system, they used hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide propellants to fire briefly to change the orbit of the space shuttle up or down in apogee and perigee, and also, most importantly, to provide the impulse to deorbit the space shuttle, to bring it back into the atmosphere so that it could return to a landing site. And those were called the OMS maneuvering system. So that was, and they also gimbaled in 2 planes each. And then the fine control of actually, and this is the way most satellites work, and it's the one that's used the most, are the reaction control system jets. And they were each roughly 400 kilos, 4,000 newtons or so of thrust. And they were spaced, there are like 12 or 16 of these, spaced at different points around the space shuttle to control translation and rotation in 3 planes. So those are the effectors of the GNC system. So I've talked to you about navigation, the sensors. I've talked about the control system, the effectors. Now, how does it all get put together? That is a software algorithm task. Uses the knowledge of orbital mechanics and takes into account the mission parameter, which is, for example, if you want to get to orbit to the International Space Station, you need to get to an altitude above the Earth of about 400 kilometers. And so, knowing that altitude, guidance does a sophisticated calculation using the 4 general purpose computers of the space shuttle to calculate what control is required based on the navigation to get to that point. The final part of guidance, navigation, control is, of course, when the space shuttle acts as an airplane. And after guidance has told control, get me into the atmosphere at what we call at a minimum safe perigee of, well, actually the space shuttle always used imperial units, and we used 400,000 feet as the height above the Earth at which the space shuttle had entered the atmosphere. That was called entry interface. And from that moment on, a combination of reaction control system jets, as well as the elevons, the ailerons that act also as elevons in the delta plane wing of the space shuttle, as well as the rudder, they would act to control the attitude of the space shuttle to be about 40 degrees of angle of attack, alpha, as it bled off the energy of 8 kilometers per second to slow down and decelerate coming into the atmosphere. And all of that control was provided initially by reaction control system jets, and then there was a general blending of reaction control system plus control surface effectors to change and monitor, change and affect the attitude of the space shuttle as it came into the atmosphere. To decelerate from 8 kilometers per second down to 200 knots, landing out at the Kennedy Space Center, the space shuttle took about 20 minutes of continuous 1.5 to 2 Gs of deceleration coming in, initially with this 40-degree angle of attack, but putting in bank so that you'd fly one way for about 5 minutes, and then you'd do an S-turn and fly the other way for about 5 minutes. And these S-turns were called hypersonic S-turns, and it was a way of keeping you going basically on a straight line over the Earth, over about a quarter of the Earth during this period. Quarter to a half of the Earth we're covering as we do this. And we come over the Earth and we finally make it to the landing point. And of course, as we slow down and come over the Kennedy Space Center at roughly Mach 2.5, 2.5 times the speed of sound, then the control surfaces take over completely, and the space shuttle behaves very much like an aircraft that a pilot is used to. And from that point onwards, the pilot can fly it normally, but knowing that they don't have an engine to go around, so they have to manage their energy. That's the kinetic energy plus their potential energy, the height energy, so that they can be sure of making the runway and landing. That's a rather brief story, actually, about guidance, navigation, and control of the space shuttle. Well, Claude is a dear friend, and it's because we shared an office, and we trained for more than a year in the water tank at the Johnson Space Center called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. And the only way we can simulate doing a spacewalk to repair the space station, the space telescope Hubble, is of course to do work in a spacesuit with the tools that you're going to use. And we have to do that in underwater, where we are neutrally buoyant. And Claude and I were a team. There were two pairs of spacewalking astronauts on my mission, STS-103, with Claude. And Claude and I were the second team. There was Steve Smith and John Gransfeld on the first team, and they did the very first spacewalk of that mission to replace gyroscopes, where they opened up the Space Telescope's doors, went inside, and removed the boxes, rate gyroscopes. There are 6 of them. Claude and I, the next day, had to go out, and we had 2 tasks. One was to replace, and this was primarily my task, was to replace a 386 computer that ran the telescope, and replace it with a 486 computer. And so at that point, Claude basically would help me retrieve tools on a tool stanchion. And I was on the end of an arm, the space shuttle arm, up high above the cargo bay, with the door to the computer bay open on the telescope, high up above the space shuttle. It's a great place to be. And Claude would float next to me. And this was in the beginning part of that spacewalk. And we were both nervous, of course, that we wouldn't do our tasks properly, and even though we trained for a year together and knew each other's tasks really, really well. Nonetheless, we were both nervous. And so I was very, very tense about this task. And for the first hour or two, I think we weren't joking. We weren't really relaxed so much. And so Claude would pass me the tools. I would reach in, undo the cables, and set up this computer. Once I had that job done, and the ground told me, "Oh, we're going to boot up the computer, power it up, please stand clear." Not that a computer's going to jump out at you. And then they told me that it was actually booting up properly and successfully. I knew that I hadn't really done anything bad to the connectors and all the gold pins of the connectors behind the box that I was manipulating with my spacesuit gloves. So I suddenly felt very, very relaxed. And in fact, tears came into my eyes, even in the spacesuit, which I couldn't wipe away because I've got the helmet there, that I hadn't broken the telescope forever. In fact, I improved it by putting the computer in. So now it's Claude's point to be, he was on point. So Claude's task now was coming up. And his job, and I'm sure you've heard this from Claude, was to replace the fine guidance sensor of the telescope, a little baby piano-sized box that you have to slide in. Well, so my task now is to be the floating astronaut off to the side, while Claude is on the arm coming into the telescope with this big box. And the box, he can't see around the box. He's just got a great big wall in front of him. At least that's the way it looked to me. And he's on the arm, and he's giving instructions to Jean-Francois Clairvoy, a European astronaut from France, who was operating the arm controls from within the cockpit of the space shuttle. And he's saying, and Claude says, okay, Jean-Francois, bring me in, 3 centimeters, up 10 centimeters, left a bit, right a bit, etc. As he brings this baby piano-sized fine guidance sensor box into the telescope. And there are 2 rails that lead into the telescope and that the box, the fine guidance sensor, has to engage with 2 little roller wheels or slide. I don't remember if they're wheels or just a slide. I think it was just a slide. And so he had to come into that. And this box is about 2 meters long in front of Claude. So he can't see anything. It's like moving a great big wall. And I'm on the side looking at perpendicular to that motion as it comes to the telescope, saying, Claude, it's looking good. I think maybe you're a bit low. You need to come up a bit. Well, there's 2 ways that Claude can come up a bit. He can either move his arms up to move the telescope, move the fine guidance sensor up, or he can ask Jean-Francois Clairvoy in the cockpit to move the arm up. And so he had to make the decision what to do. And I would give advice, but he had to make the decision what to do. Anyway, so we're both working on this, $2 billion telescope. And and Claude's a real astronomer. He doesn't want to be known for breaking it either. I was just as nervous. And he gets in about halfway, if I remember right, with the box. And then he gets stuck. And I go, and Claude says something like, I can't remember what Claude said, but I remember what I thought. I thought, it's stuck. And I thought, oh, this is terrible. And he pushes and he pushes. And I said, Claude, I think it looks like it's stuck. And he goes, yes, or something like that. And we had a little, we start to suddenly feel less relaxed and very tense about this, because we know this could be a huge problem for the telescope. And so the obvious thing to do, and Claude decided this, was to come back out from the telescope and try and start this motion over again. Well, what had happened was that it was on, as I say, it was on rails. And you need to come in straight along the ruler here. But the ruler he was coming in like that, at an angle. He was a bit too low, if I remember right. And so he's coming in at an angle, and basically the box was getting bound coming into the telescope. And so we had a discussion, Claude and I, about, did he think he was in the right position? He thought he was, based on all of the training we'd had. He thought he was at the right height above the cargo bay. But to me, floating on the side, it looked like he was very slightly lower where he was compared to where the box was going into. So the answer, I thought, was to come up a bit. And so I suggested that to Claude, and then Claude, I think, told Jean-Francois to lift him up maybe 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters. And then Claude said, okay, I'm going to start coming in again. And at that point, the box just drifted in perfectly, smoothly, and went all the way to the stops, and Claude was able to finish the task. So that was it wasn't a funny story, but it was the most memorable story I have of Claude Nicollier. And he was calm and cool throughout all of this. In fact, I think all of us were. But within our, with the little voice inside us was saying, this could be really bad if we don't fix this. So in the Hubble mission with Claude Nicollier was in 1999. But before that, I was on the launched to the space station Mir, a Russian space station that's not there anymore in space, in 1997. And I was the 5th astronaut in a series of 7 astronauts to be basically a guest on the Russian space station Mir, carrying out a number of fairly small, low-budget experiments in 1 or 2 of the Mir modules that were there. It wasn't like a Hubble repair mission. It wasn't like deploying a satellite out of the cargo bay of the shuttle. It was really pure laboratory science. That was the goal of the mission. And the goal of the mission was for me to do the experiments, to get along with my Russian crew, not to cause any problems for my Russian crew by embarrassing them, breaking something, or whatever. And basically allowing as much me interacting with my Russian crewmates as letting the American controllers in Moscow get to know Russian controllers in Moscow, managing our joint experiment program activities. So that was the whole point of this Mir mission. So and I was to be there for 4 months. So I was launched in, I think it was May of 1997. And came back from Mir in October of 1997. So I was there for about almost 5 months. And each day I would get up out of my sleeping bag, brush your teeth, etc., do all those things that you have to do. And then I'd go and read the mail. Actually, I would receive the email. And it wasn't email in those days. It was a form of telegraphy. Not quite Morse code, but very similar, where we would receive files from Moscow, and I would get those files off of a laptop computer using a radio ham modem. And that's what the Russians used. They adapted a modem for radio hams to send text files up. And I would get these text files that were written in Russian on a DOS operating system laptop. And then I would print them out and give them to the crew members, Vasily and Sasha. And they would then read them and say, oh, these are our instructions for the day. At the same time, I got my instructions that way, but my role in that crew was to act as the communications officer, getting the mail. And so then I'd read my mail, and it would say, go and operate the Svet greenhouse. This was a greenhouse that grew plants, and I had to put the seeds into the seed trays, make sure they didn't float off through the fan of the greenhouse, and grow plants that looked a bit like the vegetable broccoli. In fact, they would flower, and I would have to collect the pollen with bee sticks, and then take the pollen and fertilize the flowers with those bee sticks, so that they would then produce seed and produce another generation of seed. So that was an interesting experiment. I had an experiment then that I would go off and with beetles in it, and it was a beetle experiment. These beetles were great big things about this size that came from Kazakhstan, and they had a circadian rhythm that seemed to stay locked in step with Kazakhstan's local time of day, even though they were in space, in orbit, around the Earth, and going around the Earth every 90 minutes. Amazing creatures. And then in the evening, obviously, amongst those activities, we had to do exercise. And there were 2 treadmills on the Mir, basically, and rubber bungees as well. And all of us, all crew, were expected to exercise for about an hour each session, up to twice a day. When you exercise in space, you get all this sweat, and it pools and bubbles on you. And so you have to get cleaned up from all that sweat. It doesn't run off. And that takes another hour or so of cleanup. So exercise could take up to 3 hours a day out of the work day, leaving you about the 5 or 6 for the experiments that you're attending. The big difference between the space shuttle and the Mir was that the space shuttle was pretty much like a very well scripted, choreographed mission, where you know pretty much every day what you have to do, and you have very specific sequences, all of which you've practiced. And you've done those because the space shuttle mission just doesn't go on longer than 10 days, because it can't stay up longer than that on its own. On the Mir, or on the International Space Station, there the experiments have results. And so what you do based on the experiment result may be different. So you don't train for all of those results. And so sometimes there'll be a pause, and the investigators who are responsible and own those experiments on the ground will say, Michael, we're not going to have you work on the greenhouse today. We're going to have you work with growing colloids in space. And you go, okay. So it was a very flexible, much more like coming to the office, coming to the laboratory type of job, where you didn't really know what was coming up the next week, because it depended really on the priorities of what was going on this week on the station. And then, of course, equipment breaks, or cargo ships arrive, or emergencies happen that can change your day. And so that's the difference in character between a space station long duration mission and a short, directed, focused space shuttle mission. On the Mir space station, this was the very first interaction of American astronauts with Russian cosmonauts since the Apollo-Soyuz joint docking program in 1975, which was when I was still in university, actually school. So this was a big deal for Americans and Russians. It was the end of the Cold War, and it was a way by which Americans and Russians could show they are working together in space. Nonetheless, that meant that Russians had had no experience speaking English, and it meant that Americans, including Michael Foale, had no experience speaking Russian. And the big challenge, the biggest challenge for me and the other American astronauts who were sent to Mir was to learn the Russian language, because the Mir was already built. There was no labels on the equipment in Russian and English like they are on the International Space Station. On Mir, they were all in Russian. And so all of us had to learn Russian. We went through intensive Russian language training. It took probably 3 months of dedicated 8 hours a day, one-on-one Russian language training, before the Russians in Star City, where I was living with my family, said, you are ready now to have lectures in Russian. And so because of all of that extra training that I'd received in learning Russian, the Russian cosmonauts didn't have any extra training to learn English at that point. They do now going to the International Space Station. You know, so when I meet cosmonauts today in America, in Houston, and they're young cosmonauts and they're trying to learn English, I know I can talk to them in Russian, but I don't. I let them speak English because I remember what Sasha said to me. All of the communications on the Mir went through Moscow in general. For emergencies, there were 2 ground stations set up in the United States that would allow us to talk to Americans, basically, for about 10 minutes. They were sometimes scheduled, but most of the time, all of it went through ground stations over the Russian territories, and we were funneled up through Moscow and through the, we called him Glavny Operator. It's like a Capcom. The collision of the cargo spacecraft took place about 6 weeks into this 4.5-month stay of mine on the space station Mir. And the reasons for it are a different story, but the result was it hit the space station Mir so that it actually went out of attitude. In fact, it was out of attitude for normal solar power collection to enable the docking of the cargo ship in a proper direction. Once the collision had taken place, the space station tumbled. And as it tumbles, as it moves, its solar arrays no longer point towards the sun. And so, you know, if the sun's over here and it's tumbling, the solar array can't see the sun anymore. And the electric power of the station basically went to zero. And all we were left with was the batteries. Well, the batteries have enough capacity for about 1.5 orbits, about 2 hours. And then you're done. You've got no more power on the station. So the immediate consequence of the collision was that we lost electrical power systems, or all electrical power. All of the fans, I mean, to you as an astronaut or cosmonaut on board, to you, the first thing you notice is the lights go off. And you also notice something, it becomes really, really quiet. And that's because all of the fans, and there are fans everywhere on a spacecraft, moving air around so that carbon dioxide doesn't accumulate and suffocate you, and also brings fresh oxygen so that you can breathe it. Those fans that are always humming and whirring, they're just like computer fans if you listen to your computer. They stopped. So it was absolutely silent and dark. And then as we go around the Earth every 90 minutes, and the night pass can be about 30 minutes long. You go into the dark side of the Earth, and it starts to get cold because there's no heat. And the temperature of space around the Earth is about minus 150 Celsius. And so the space station is getting really, really cold. So it's cold, quiet, and dark. That's the consequence to you as an astronaut. From a recovery point of view, our task was to try and get electrical power. And of course, we can't talk to the ground. And the ground can't talk to us because there's no electric power. So our task was, and this is what Sasha and myself and Vasily Tsibleev did, Sasha Lazutkin you mentioned. We came up with a scheme to do something that had never been done before with the Mir station in that configuration, which was to disconnect the electrical power of the Soyuz lifeboat spacecraft from the Mir space station, disconnect its power, so we could turn its batteries on. And that took about 2 orbits, about 3 hours. And once we got that achieved, we then were able to turn the Soyuz spacecraft on and using its batteries, and fire and disconnect its guidance, navigation, and control system, which thought, you know, hey, I'm a little Soyuz, I'm nimble, and I expect that when I fire my thruster this way, I'll get this much angular rate. All that had to be disconnected in the Soyuz because we had the Mir space station, which weighs 100 tons attached to it. But the goal was to use the Soyuz to move the space station in attitude about 2 axes. We couldn't control about the roll axis because the moment was just too small. But about pitch and yaw with the Soyuz, we were going to try and move the station to have a spin so that its solar arrays pointed towards the sun as we rotated, and a fairly stable orientation. As it turned out, that moment of inertia, that axis that we were trying to spin about, is the middle moment of inertia of an irregular body. And anyone who's studied mechanics and kinematics at a high level will know that the middle moment of inertia is unstable. And I sort of suspected that at the time, but we didn't know what the moments of inertia were of the Mir station about those axes. And what that meant was that we would spin for about 2 orbits one way, basically getting some sunlight, and we were able to turn the lights on and the fans were on, and we were able to talk to the ground. But then after 2 orbits, it would do a kind of a flip, and then it would face the other way and not get any sunlight. And we'd go another 2 orbits without any sunlight on the solar arrays, and then it would do another flip, and then we would get sunlight on the arrays again. And then by getting the batteries charged up, then we were able to talk to Moscow over the Russian territory, over their ground sites, and then the Russian Mir operators in Moscow were able to send commands to activate the thrusters, the reaction control system thrusters of the Mir station, to actually stop the spin that we put on it, and to then slowly and methodically get the solar arrays stable, pointed, and not spinning towards the sun. And from that point onwards, we were basically in a recovered situation. However, the consequence of the collision was that it created a hole in the station at that moment. And Sasha and I, over a period of about 6 minutes, had to disconnect large electrical cables going to that module that had been punctured. And it was called the Spectre module. And in disconnecting those cables, we disconnected 30% of the electrical power of the Mir. So that power wasn't available at all. And so we were, as a result of that power cut, we could own, 2 of the other modules had to be completely left powered off and were cold and collecting a lot of water as condensation, maybe 2 or 3 tons of water, 2 or 3 cubic meters of water were collecting in those modules. As we lived and made do with the base block of the Mir station. Luzutkin and I had to disconnect the Spectre solar power arrays so that we could put a hatch cover in place and stop the air leaving the space station through that module. About 3 weeks later, another cargo ship was sent to us, which docked automatically and successfully. And it carried with it a plug with cable pass-throughs, plugs, that allowed another crew that was sent up after Sasha and Vasily. I stayed on board, but another Russian crew was sent up. So I had 2 crews. And they performed an inside spacewalk to connect up that hatch plug, to connect up the cables that Sasha and I had disconnected to save the space station. And that was done about 2 months after the collision. And then finally, I went outside with Anatoly Solovyov, the commander, to look for the damage on the outside of the Spectre module. We didn't find we could see the damage, but we couldn't find the hole. And that was in September. And just as the space shuttle was coming to bring me home in October, I had worked to dry up all of the water that was in the 2 modules that had been powered off. And we were just preparing to turn those modules back on. But that never happened while I was there. I think it happened after I left. So to answer your question briefly, about 3 months at least. I wanted to be an astronaut from the age of 6 until, well, now. And my father was a Royal Air Force pilot, and I was very impressed by the romance, the idea of flying. I loved watching birds. I had radio. I had many aircraft models. And when I learned about the American space program and the goal of landing on the moon, I was about 6 years old then. I sort of told myself I wanted to be an astronaut. At some point, I wanted to cure cancer as well because my uncle died of cancer. But that was my goal. And the way I saw it happening was to become a pilot in the Royal Air Force and become a test pilot, because that's the way all the astronauts had done, as far as I knew, up to that point. But when I applied to the Royal Air Force for the actual medical tests, I didn't pass the eye test. And that meant I was devastated by this news, and changed all of my plans. I was one of the rare boys that had an idea of what he wanted to do when he grew up. And all of a sudden I thought I couldn't do what I wanted to do when I grew up. However, I was always good at physics and making model airplanes. And I basically focused on that and worked at the physics, got to the University of Cambridge, studied physics at Cambridge. And it was when I was just about to take my final exams as an undergraduate in physics, at Cambridge, thinking I might be a geophysicist or a geologist or something like that. I learned that the Space Shuttle program was looking for scientist astronauts. And so I suddenly became very, very focused on getting a really, really good physics exam result as an undergraduate so I could do the PhD in physics. Because I knew I needed the PhD in physics to apply to be a scientist astronaut.